Before we start, if you enjoy the story, please leave a like and check if you're subscribed. The Geiger counter's clicks accelerated as Ethan Cross pushed through hemlock, each pulse raising fine hairs along his forearms. 3 miles from his cabin, and the radiation signature climbed with every step, concentrated, deliberate, wrong for this stretch of British Columbia wilderness. He'd found strange things in these mountains over the years, but this felt different. The forest opened where something had carved a trench through soil and bedrock. Ethan stopped at the tree line, rifle unslung, studying the object half buried in scarred earth. Curved metal covered in char patterns and biological growth suggesting years of exposure. The size of a small car, ovoid, with seams obscured by damage. The pines around the impact had grown toward it rather than away, trunks bent at angles that suggested the crash predated their saplings. He approached slowly, boots quiet on needle carpet. No military markings, no corporate warnings, just this impossible thing the forest had been digesting while he'd lived 3 miles away unaware. The Geiger counter stayed elevated but steady. He circled once, noting how light caught the metal's surface with a quality that wasn't quite reflection, more like the thing was drinking illumination and releasing it on fractional delay. The hatch opened before he touched it. Light spilled from the interior, blue shifted and soft, accompanied by a sound like wind through glass. A holographic display flickered above the opening. His own face stared back, 3-dimensional rendering capturing the scar above his eyebrow, the way his hair fell when he forgot to trim it. Audio followed from his podcast, his voice discussing indigenous knowledge and humanity's need to remember that dominance isn't wisdom. Ethan Cross, do you still believe humans can change their behavior before it's too late? His chest constricted. Those words not from any podcast, but from Sarah's hospital room 3 years ago, her voice already thin with illness. He forced air into his lungs and kept the rifle ready. Who's asking? Interior lighting intensified, revealing the cramped chamber within. A figure lay curled in what looked like medical stasis, and Ethan's brain stuttered processing what his eyes reported. Small, maybe 5 feet, with skin that caught light wrong. Not brown or tan, but pink with underlying shimmer that shifted as he adjusted angle. White hair cut short, asymmetrical. Pointed ears twitching slightly despite apparent unconsciousness. She looked rendered by an animator with unlimited budget and no regard for plausibility, except she was breathing shallow breaths that fogged the transparent panel above her face. I am Seris, reconnaissance officer of the Talvari Expeditionary Fleet. I have been listening to your world's transmissions for 3 years while trapped in failing stasis. I chose these coordinates based on your expressed philosophy. I require assistance and your species requires warning. Will you help me? Ethan's mind worked through scenarios. Elaborate hoax seemed most likely, except nobody knew he was here. Hallucination from contamination, except his thinking felt sharp and the Geiger numbers were survivable. That left the explanation his rationality rejected, but his gut accepted. She was exactly what she claimed, and his life had just become incomprehensibly complicated. You've been conscious in there for 3 years? Affirmative. Primary systems failed during atmospheric entry. Life support maintained minimal function until power reserves depleted 6 months ago. I have been aware, but immobile. He tried imagining that. Awake, trapped, listening to a world you couldn't reach. The claustrophobia alone would destroy sanity. He studied her face through the panel, looking for psychological damage, but saw only exhaustion in features too delicate to read clearly. Why me specifically? Your podcast episodes about grief and decision-making suggested you understand that optimal outcomes and meaningful choices are not always synonymous. I needed someone who values significance over efficiency. Also, multiple factions are tracking this site. I estimate 18 hours before containment teams arrive with authorization to secure alien technology through any means necessary. That timeline includes human witnesses. The display shifted, showing radio intercepts, military frequencies mixed with private security channels, grid coordinates close enough, and terminology that made dissection sound routine. And if I report you, then I become a specimen. You become a security risk, and my people's High Council proceeds with their existing assessment that Earth's dominant species lack strategic value beyond resource extraction. 3 weeks from now, your world receives an ultimatum: accept managed relocation or face population reduction. Ethan's laugh came harsh. You're telling me aliens are coming to evict humanity, and our best option is trusting you? I crashed within walking distance deliberately, using the last of my ship's power, because 3 years of listening convinced me humanity produces individuals capable of understanding that sometimes the only rational choice is irrational loyalty to something that doesn't optimize survival. I have violated every protocol to reach someone who might help rather than dissect me. We are both making terrible decisions for insufficient reasons. The question is whether we make them together or separately. He lowered the rifle and approached, crouching beside the hatch. Up close, details crystallized. Her skin really was pink, soft-looking with that shimmer playing across the surface. Her eyes opened as he leaned in, large and lavender-colored with pupils that weren't quite round. Her expression held vulnerability that punched through every wall he'd built around human connection. Can you move? Stasis effects persist, muscle coordination is compromised, I require assistance. Ethan set the rifle aside and reached in, his hands finding her arm, warm beneath his fingers, texture strange but not unpleasant. She weighed almost nothing as he guided her from the pod, frame, bird-delicate beneath fitted uniform. She barely reached his chest standing upright, and his protective instincts flared with uncomfortable intensity. This was a trained officer from an advanced species, not a child, but her size made every interaction feel like handling something breakable. Seris swayed, catching herself against his arm. Her grip was stronger than expected, fingers small but precise. Your gravity is significant. How much stronger than yours? Approximately 15%, manageable with adjustment, but equilibrium requires recalibration. He kept one hand on her shoulder while she found balance. Her pointed ears tracked sounds he couldn't distinguish. Birds, wind through branches, distant creek whisper. Everything about her telegraphed awareness despite physical weakness. My cabin is 3 miles northeast. Can you make that? Affirmative, though not quickly. Then we move now. Ethan retrieved his pack, then hesitated before pulling his jacket off and offering it. She took it with a slight nod, understanding the tactical reasoning even if the gesture confused her. They left the pod open and obvious. Better to let searchers find the crash site quickly rather than waste time tracking. The cabin required knowing terrain well enough to navigate without trails, 3 miles through forest that would slow any team unfamiliar with elevation changes and drainage patterns. Seris moved with surprising efficiency once coordination stabilized, gait adapting to Earth's gravity through conscious correction. She didn't talk, focusing on maintaining pace, but he caught her watching him, studying how he read forest and chose path. Her intelligence was obvious in those observations, the way she noted his decisions and adjusted movement to match rhythm. The return took twice as long as his outbound journey. Twilight settled by the time they reached the cabin. Single large room with sleeping area, kitchen, workspace visible from the door. Wood stove at the heart, solar panels, and satellite uplink providing connectivity when wanted. Isolation was choice, not necessity. Seris entered slowly, her assessment systematic. She'd been listening to his podcast from inside that pod, learning about him while he'd had no idea she existed. It felt invasive and intimate equally. This matches the shelter patterns you described. You built this space for isolation, not community. That was the idea. And now you have brought an alien into it, ending that isolation permanently. Why? Ethan closed the door and racked his rifle, buying time. The truth was too complicated. Seeing her trapped had triggered every protective instinct Sarah's death had left dormant. Her question about human capacity for change had cut directly to the wound he'd been nursing 3 years. Some part of him recognized this as the exact opposite of safe, but couldn't refuse anyway. Because you asked, and because I'm tired of making the smart choice if the smart choice is always no. Seris studied him in silence, then nodded once. I understand. You are choosing meaning over optimization. I will attempt to not make you regret this before we both die. Comforting. I do not yet understand human humor, but I believe that was sarcasm. Despite everything, the impossibility, the danger, the fact that his quiet life had just ended permanently, Ethan found himself almost smiling. He pulled spare blankets from storage and began preparing the sleeping area, hyper-aware of the small figure standing in his cabin, wearing his oversized jacket, white hair catching lamplight. 3 years he'd spent alone in these mountains, convincing himself distance meant safety. Now an alien woman, barely 5 feet tall, stood in his home asking him to bet humanity's survival on irrational loyalty. And the scariest part was how easily he'd already decided to try. Outside, the forest settled into night. Inside, 2 people from impossible distances began the fragile work of building trust before the world came looking for answers they didn't have. Morning brought strange domesticity. Seris sat at the kitchen table wearing Ethan's thermal shirt, fabric swallowing her petite frame, sleeves rolled multiple times, studying his laptop with military precision while he made coffee. Your beverage contains stimulants sufficient to cause cardiac stress in Talvari physiology, yet you consume it voluntarily each morning. Welcome to humanity. Ethan set a cup beside her, watching steam play across her pink skin. We excel at enjoying things that are technically bad for us. This explains much about your species' decision-making. He almost smiled, second time in 12 hours, more than the previous 12 months combined. Her literal interpretations diffused tension, and he kept forgetting she was an alien officer rather than someone awkwardly navigating cultural immersion. Seris's fingers moved across the keyboard with surprising dexterity, pulling up classified documents that shouldn't be accessible. She'd explained that Talvari neural implants interfaced with electronic systems through pattern recognition, reading electromagnetic signatures and extrapolating access. Watching her work reminded him she was fundamentally different despite humanoid appearance. I have located the relevant protocols. She turned the laptop. Talvari High Council Resolution 847, Earth-designated developmental contamination zone, human expansion classified as aggressive and unstable, recommended intervention, forced relocation or population reduction to pre-industrial levels. Ethan read twice, processing bureaucratic language describing genocide as resource management. The clinical tone made it worse, not malice but pure pragmatism, humanity reduced to variables. This is what you are assessing. Affirmative. My mission was cultural reconnaissance and threat evaluation. Determine whether your species demonstrated sufficient strategic value to justify integration rather than containment. And your conclusion. Seris met his eyes, lavender gaze holding something unreadable. I crashed deliberately to reach you because 3 years of monitoring convinced me my people's methodology was fundamentally flawed. We evaluate species based on logical optimization. We do not account for adaptive value of choices that defy strategic calculation. You're saying we're too irrational to measure. I am saying your irrationality may be your greatest evolutionary advantage. My people eliminated that capacity 6 generations ago when we optimized away emotional volatility. She closed the laptop carefully. We have not produced original art or philosophical innovation since. We expand and optimize and achieve perfect strategic outcomes in service of continuation that has no meaning beyond survival. The admission carried unexpected weight. Ethan studied her delicate features, young-looking and vulnerable, despite intelligence evident in every gesture. Her appearance created constant dissonance, protective instincts flaring against the reality that she was probably more dangerous than him, despite being barely 5 feet tall. Why crash near me specifically? Your podcast about grief discussed choices after your wife's death. You stated that meaning cannot be calculated, only chosen, and that sometimes the rational decision is to refuse rationality in favor of what matters despite cost. Her ears swiveled, tracking sounds outside. That suggested you might understand what I need humanity to prove, that emotional reasoning produces adaptive outcomes pure logic cannot predict. Hell of a gamble based on podcast monologues. Yes, which demonstrates my point precisely. The laptop chimed. Seris's expression shifted instantly to tactical focus as she pulled up new data. Multiple vehicles entering the valley from south, military-grade signatures, estimated arrival 40 minutes. That was faster than 18 hours. Someone improved their algorithms. She stood abruptly, movements shedding stasis recovery stiffness. We need to evacuate. I can guide us to my pod. Chorus has maintained partial sensor arrays. Chorus? My ship's artificial intelligence distributed consciousness across remaining systems. It has been monitoring since my recovery. Ethan gathered essentials: survival pack, water filtration, medical supplies, ammunition. His emergency cache was 8 miles northeast in terrain that would slow pursuit, but 40 minutes wasn't enough. They'd have to move fast. He pulled his hunting rifle and checked the load, then retrieved the compact pistol Sarah had insisted on keeping. She'd laughed and said humans were more dangerous than bears. Looking at Seris's tactical map, he figured she'd been right. They left through the back as helicopter rotors became audible. Seris moved with remarkable efficiency through undergrowth, her smaller frame navigating tight spaces while alien agility compensated for terrain unfamiliarity. Ethan adjusted his pace to maintain proximity rather than slow down. Another reminder appearances deceived. 2 miles out, Chorus's voice emerged from Seris's device, layered audio like multiple speakers slightly out of sync. Seris, I am detecting additional signatures converging from west. Configuration matches private military contractors. They are not coordinating with primary response. Mercenaries, Ethan muttered. Someone wants alien technology badly enough to hire specialists. This complicates retreat. Seris studied the forest with trained assessment. If multiple factions pursue without coordination, they may engage each other before locating us, or saturate the area and make escape impossible. She nodded and continued moving. Another mile before Chorus interrupted. New contact approaching northeast, single individual, unarmed. Dr. Miranda Zhao, Xenobiological Research Division. She requests communication and claims to represent Classified First Contact Program. Ethan gestured for Seris to take cover while he positioned himself with sight lines. Minutes later, a woman appeared. Late 30s, Asian features, nervous energy suggesting intelligence over combat training. She stopped when she saw his rifle raising both hands. Ethan Cross, I'm not with military teams. I need to speak with you before they arrive. How did you find us? Satellite thermal analysis and trajectory projection. I've been tracking first contact scenarios for 3 years. When the alert went out about a crash site near your location, I knew you'd either report it or help. Your podcast suggested the latter. Seris emerged. Zhao's eyes widened with undisguised fascination, expression cycling through shock, wonder, and professional assessment before settling into cautious optimism. You're Talvari. Your species' probe signals have been monitored 18 months. We've been preparing first contact protocols assuming diplomatic engagement, not military containment. Your government's response suggests otherwise, Seris replied. Because you're classified as crash debris instead of diplomatic envoy. If we can get you to my research facility, I can invoke protection protocols giving us time to establish proper communication with your people. Ethan studied Zhao's body language. Genuine enthusiasm tempered with urgency, no obvious deception, but also focused intensity of someone convinced their agenda was correct regardless of consent. What's the catch? No catch, but we need to move. Commander Voss's team is 15 minutes behind me with authorization to secure alien assets through lethal force if necessary. That includes both of you as witnesses. Seris pulled Ethan aside, her smaller hand finding his arm with surprising firmness. I have analyzed 17 security vulnerabilities in her proposal. Her facility will become containment regardless of intentions, and institutional loyalties will override personal ethics when superiors demand access. But she's right that staying out here gets us killed. There is a third option. Seris's lavender eyes held his with intensity that tightened his chest. I surrender myself to minimize casualties. My death removes Talvari obligation to retrieve their officer and eliminates technology leverage, making Earth's immediate subjugation necessary. The words hit harder than expected. Ethan recognized the logic because he'd employed the same ruthless pragmatism after Sarah died. Remove yourself from equations you can't solve. Minimize damage through strategic absence. 3 years convinced isolation was wisdom when it was really grief in philosophical clothing. No. Ethan, the mathematics are clear? I didn't survive 3 years convincing myself caring always ends in regret just to watch you choose death as the efficient solution. His hands found her shoulders, feeling delicate frame belying strength. We haven't exhausted creative options yet. What alternative do you propose that doesn't end with either you dead or humanity enslaved? He didn't have an answer. The moment stretched between them, weighted with impossible choices and insufficient time. Seris's expression held something transcending formal training, fear maybe, or gratitude for his refusal to accept her sacrifice as inevitable. Gunfire erupted from the south, Voss's team engaging Zhao's position. The scientist had led pursuit directly to them. Seris's hand found Ethan's, fingers interlacing in a gesture simultaneously alien and achingly familiar. Northeast toward the pod, Chorus can provide cover using remaining defensive systems. They ran as the forest erupted with tactical chatter and weapons fire. Multiple factions converging on coordinates that had been safe isolation 12 hours ago. Ethan's last thought before focus narrowed to pure survival was how small Seris's hand felt in his, and how completely he'd committed to keeping her alive, despite every rational calculation suggesting they were both already dead. The tracking drones forced separation 2 miles from the pod. Ethan heard their high-pitched whine and made the split-second call. Seris northeast toward the cache site, him drawing pursuit south toward terrain he knew intimately. Her lavender eyes held his for half a second, understanding passing wordlessly. Then she vanished into undergrowth with trained speed. He ran through country where Sarah's ashes were scattered, realizing the ghosts he'd tried to escape were now witnesses to whether he'd learned anything about fighting for connection instead of accepting loss as inevitable. The drones tracked him 20 minutes before he used the creek's mineral content and canyon walls to break their sensor lock. By the time he reached rendezvous coordinates, full dark had settled, and he had no way of knowing if Seris had made it. The cache site was a natural depression ringed by granite that blocked aerial surveillance. Ethan settled into cold stone and waited, rifle ready, trying not to calculate odds of her being captured or killed. The vigil stretched through hours that felt like days, and he understood with brutal clarity that his philosophy of detachment hadn't been wisdom, but cowardice, dressed in pragmatic language. Dawn arrived with mist rising from the valley. Ethan spotted movement in the tree line and brought the rifle up before recognizing her silhouette, smaller than any human pursuer, moving with careful deliberation suggesting injury or exhaustion. He was beside her in seconds, hands checking for serious damage before conscious thought caught up. "I'm functional," Seris said, but her voice carried strain contradicting the words. Her pink skin was pale with cold stress, white hair plastered to her skull, uniform torn along one shoulder. She'd crossed the northern creek to break scent trail, and the water temperature had nearly incapacitated her. Ethan stripped off his jacket and wrapped it around her shoulders despite protest. She was shivering, fine tremors running through her smaller frame, and he pulled her against his chest without asking, sharing body heat. She stiffened initially, then relaxed into the contact with a shaky exhale. They sat in silence while her shivering subsided. Ethan registered how perfectly her frame fit against him when held close. The iridescent quality of her skin had muted with cold stress, pointed ears lying flat against her skull instead of their usual alertness. Vulnerability made her look even younger despite the intelligence operating behind those 2 large eyes. "Chorus has been analyzing human cultural databases for leverage points," she said finally, voice muffled against his shoulder. "Historical examples exist of smaller populations negotiating survival through strategic value demonstration. Most of those examples involved having something the larger power wanted, which Earth apparently doesn't. That is the operational challenge." She pulled back slightly, meeting his eyes. "Your original question remains relevant. Do you still believe humans can change behavior before consequences become irreversible?" I built my life around avoiding that question because answering it requires hope I didn't trust myself to sustain. And now? He studied her face, delicate features that had seemed impossibly fictional 2 days ago, but now carried more reality than anything in his carefully constructed isolation. Her appearance still triggered protective instincts, but beneath that surface response lay recognition of someone equally damaged by loss and equally determined to find meaning despite cost. Now I think maybe hope isn't about confidence in outcomes. Maybe it's just choosing to care when logic says caring costs too much. Seris's expression shifted through something that might have been surprised recognition. Her hand found his cold fingers wrapping around his palm, and the gesture felt simultaneously foreign and achingly familiar. My people eliminated grief through genetic modification 6 generations ago. We achieved perfect emotional equilibrium and stopped producing anything worth grieving for. Her thumb traced across his knuckles. I volunteered for deep space reconnaissance specifically to escape a culture that felt complete but hollow, seeking something my training said was illogical, but my instincts insisted must exist. Did you find it? I found you, a human who chose isolation to protect himself from caring and discovered that safety without connection is just elaborate stasis. Her lavender eyes held his with intensity that made breathing difficult. We are both excellent at survival and terrible at admitting what makes survival worthwhile. Ethan wanted to kiss her, the impulse hit with surprising force, but cognitive dissonance stopped him. Not because she wasn't attractive, but because he didn't know if the gesture translated across species, whether his desire was reciprocated or just human projection. Seris solved the problem by leaning forward and pressing her forehead against his, smaller hands finding his face with careful deliberation. The contact sent warmth through him that had nothing to do with thermal regulation. Her breath ghosted across his lips. Talvari bonding practices involve bioresonance synchronization rather than physical contact as primary intimacy, she murmured. But I have been unconsciously trying to sync my biorhythms to yours since the cabin. My culture would classify this as inappropriate emotional compromise. It feels like the first honest thing I have done since entering deep space. I don't know what bioresonance feels like. Like this. She closed the remaining distance and kissed him. Soft exploration that tasted faintly of something he couldn't identify, her lips warm despite lingering cold. The kiss stayed gentle, tentative, both learning how this worked across species barriers. Her smaller hands slid into his hair and he pulled her closer, careful of her more delicate frame, but not holding back intensity. They separated slowly, foreheads still touching, breathing synchronized. That was not operationally optimal, Seris said quietly. No? No, but I find I no longer care about operational optimization. Chorus's voice interrupted from the device Seris carried, layered harmonics conveying urgency. Seris, Talvari forward ships have accelerated timeline. They will achieve Earth orbit in 4 days, responding to your distress beacon activation. You have limited time to make your case through the quantum communication array. 4 days. Ethan processed the compressed timeline while Seris pulled up tactical maps showing human military positions saturating the region. Reaching the pod meant going back through hostile territory, now swarming with multiple factions shifted from search and recover to containment protocols. We can use the chaos to our advantage, Ethan offered. Multiple groups fighting each other creates coverage gaps. You are willing to risk your life for a desperate gamble that benefits humanity abstractly while probably getting you killed personally. Seris studied him with an expression he couldn't quite read. That level of irrational sacrifice makes no strategic sense. I watched my wife die knowing there was nothing I could do, and spent 3 years believing helplessness was the essential human condition. His hands found her shoulders, grounding himself in the physical reality of her presence. Meeting you taught me the difference between accepting inevitable outcomes and choosing surrender. I'm done surrendering to the idea that caring always ends in regret. Even when the person I'm caring about has pink skin and pointed ears and comes from a species that considers my entire emotional range a genetic flaw. Her laugh came quiet and surprised. You romanticize our situation. Maybe, but I'd rather try and fail than spend another 3 years wondering if I could have made different choices. They planned their approach while Chorus provided tactical updates, human forces consolidating positions, mercenary teams establishing perimeter control, government helicopters maintaining aerial surveillance. The window for infiltration was closing rapidly, and both knew the next hours would determine whether her faith in humanity's unpredictable value and his renewed faith in meaningful action were justified or just another version of delusions both their philosophies claimed to have transcended. If we fail, your species faces subjugation, Seris said. If we succeed, my people will classify me as emotionally compromised and potentially unstable. I will face censure regardless of outcome. Is it worth it? She kissed him again, briefer this time but no less intense, then pulled back with expression holding both fear and determination. 3 years I listened to your voice from inside that pod, learning what it meant to believe meaning exists beyond optimization. You asked if humans can change before consequences become irreversible. Her fingers interlaced with his, small but strong. I am betting my life the answer is yes, that your capacity for irrational loyalty represents evolutionary advantage my people cannot predict or replicate. That love might matter more than logic when the universe presents problems pure calculation cannot solve. They gathered equipment and began moving toward the pod as sunrise broke across the mountains. 2 people from impossible distances choosing connection over safety, commitment over calculation, knowing they might both die, proving some things mattered more than survival optimization. Ethan's last thought before tactical focus narrowed was how right Seris's hand felt in his and how completely his life had transformed in 3 days, from elaborate isolation to desperate gamble for meaning that transcended species, training, and every rational objection his grief had constructed to protect him from exactly this vulnerability. The approach to the pod became running battle through overlapping kill zones. Ethan used improvised tactics, collapsing deadfall to block pursuit, triggering rock slide that forced mercenaries to regroup, while Seris provided tactical analysis and physical capability compensating for his human limitations. Her smaller size let her access angles he couldn't, his greater mass protecting her when direct confrontation became unavoidable. They fought as complementary unit. Ethan experienced visceral fear when Seris took risks, her training justified, but his protective instincts rejected. Seris felt unfamiliar terror when his larger body interposed between her and threats she was trained to handle, both learning that caring meant accepting vulnerability alongside strength. The final sprint cost them. Ethan took a round through his left shoulder that spun him sideways. Only Seris's quick reflexes kept him from going down. She dragged him the last 50 meters with strength belying her petite frame, pink skin flushed with exertion, white hair wild. They sealed themselves inside with pursuing forces beating against the exterior hull. Chorus activated immediately, defensive systems buying minutes rather than hours. Ethan slumped against the wall, while Seris's hands moved across his shoulder with clinical precision, assessing damage through torn fabric. Through and through, he managed. I'm functional. You are injured protecting me from threats I was trained to neutralize. Yeah, well, training doesn't override instinct. Her lavender eyes met his with gratitude and frustration equally. She pressed field dressing against the wound harder than necessary, processing fear through action. Chorus's voice filled the cramped space. Quantum communication array online. High Arbiter Nevik responding to priority channel. You have approximately 12 minutes before human forces breach the hull. The holographic display activated. High Arbiter Nevik appeared, elderly Talvari with rose-gold skin and austere presence commanding attention despite being projection. His expression held clinical assessment Ethan recognized from doctors delivering terminal diagnoses. Reconnaissance Officer Seris. You have violated multiple protocols, compromised operational security, and initiated unauthorized first contact. Explain why the High Council should not proceed with Earth subjugation and your immediate recall for psychological evaluation. Seris stood, posture shifting into formal military bearing despite exhaustion. her smaller frame straightened with dignity, transcending physical stature. High Arbiter, I submit that our assessment methodology contains fundamental flaw. We evaluate species based on logical optimization. We do not account for adaptive value of choices that defy strategic calculation. Human irrationality represents evolutionary advantage. Talvari logic cannot predict or replicate. That reasoning justifies chaos as virtue. It justifies survival through adaptation rather than optimization. Earth's biosphere survived multiple extinction events through persistence of seemingly maladaptive traits that became advantages when circumstances shifted unpredictably. Humanity's refusal to accept logical limits operates on same principle at cognitive level. Nevik's expression didn't shift. Your argument lacks empirical support. Provide demonstrable evidence that emotional reasoning produces outcomes pure logic cannot achieve. Ethan watched Seris hesitate, cycling through prepared arguments that wouldn't satisfy the arbiter's demand for proof. She was trying to argue on her people's terms instead of demonstrating the actual difference humanity represented. He pushed himself upright despite the shoulder wound's protest. With respect, Arbiter, your framework assumes optimization equals survival. But Earth's evolutionary history proves persistence through unpredictable adaptation often trumps optimization for known conditions. Humanity's gift and curse is willingness to break every rule, including survival optimization, when some irrational loyalty or love suggests an alternative. Nevik's attention shifted to him with clinical interest. You are the human Seris chose to contact. Your presence validates her operational compromise rather than her thesis. Maybe. But if Talvari culture can't predict or value human unpredictability, then eliminating humanity removes the one species in contact range that might save you from your own completeness when the universe presents problems pure logic can't solve. An interesting hypothesis lacking evidence. Seris made the choice that defined both resolutions. She stepped forward, her smaller hand finding Ethan's despite the formal context. High Arbiter, I offer myself as evidence. I have violated every protocol and risked everything to protect one human whose value cannot be calculated through strategic metrics. If you want proof that emotional reasoning produces survival advantage, observe that I, trained reconnaissance officer acting on irrational attachment, have accomplished what your strategic planning apparatus failed to achieve. She transmitted data that made Ethan's breath catch. Bioresonance readings showing physiological synchronization with his patterns, medical scans documenting emotional responses, communication logs proving she'd chosen him deliberately over optimal tactical options. I stake my status and freedom on his survival as demonstration that human loyalty inspires protective investment even from species designed to transcend such weakness. I formally request the Council accept me as living proof that humanity's unpredictability represents evolutionary advantage worth preserving. If one human could make a Talvari officer choose love over logic in days, imagine what humanity might contribute to alliance over generations. Silence stretched. Nevik studied the data with expression revealing nothing, then focused on Ethan with assessment that felt like dissection. Officer Seris has either proven her thesis or demonstrated catastrophic judgment compromise. The only way to determine which is observing whether her human survives consequences of this gamble. Therefore, Earth receives provisional alliance status contingent on humanity demonstrating adaptive value she claims, her continued survival and status bond to Earth's successful integration. Relief and terror hit simultaneously. Seris had just linked her fate permanently to humanity's behavior, betting her life that his species would prove her faith justified. External sounds changed as Talvari forces established orbital presence and broadcast first contact terms. Voss's operation collapsed once corporate sponsors realized alien technology would come through legitimate channels. The immediate threat dissolved, replaced by complications neither had anticipated. They emerged to face human authorities and media presence, making their connection suddenly, uncomfortably public. Cameras caught Seris supporting Ethan's injured form, her pink skin and pointed ears, triggering responses ranging from wonder to fetishization. Reporters shouted questions while military brass demanded briefings. Their bond had become political symbol, whether they wanted that or not. 3 days later, Ethan's shoulder was healing and Earth's governments were negotiating formal treaties. He found Seris at the cabin window, watching snowfall through pines with expression he'd learned to read despite alien features. Her smaller frame looked tense beneath borrowed clothes. My people have formally censured me for emotional compromise. I retain rank but will never advance. They see me as contaminated by human irrationality. Regret it? No, but I fear I have chosen poorly for you as well. She turned to face him, lavender eyes holding concern. Your isolation is permanently disrupted. You have become unavoidable spokesperson for human Talvari cooperation, and your relationship with me subjects you to scrutiny and objectification based on my appearance rather than our actual connection. Ethan crossed to her, hands finding her shoulders with familiar ease. The size difference still registered. She barely reached his chest, but now that translated to rightness rather than cognitive dissonance. After Sarah died, I convinced myself distance meant safety, that if I didn't care about anything, I couldn't lose anything worth grieving for. His thumbs traced along her collarbones, feeling her smaller frame's tension. You asked if I believed humans could change before consequences became irreversible. I think maybe we can. Not because we're inherently good, but because we're capable of choosing meaning over optimization when it matters. That is not an answer about whether you regret this. I don't regret you. I regret that your sacrifice might cost more than either of us anticipated. She almost smiled. I spent 3 years in stasis listening to your voice convince me that some things are worth experiencing regardless of cost. You represent the possibility I crossed interstellar space to find. That meaning exists not despite irrationality, but because of courage to care when logic says caring costs too much. He kissed her, still learning how this worked across species, but finding it easier each time. Her smaller hands slid into his hair, and she pressed closer despite his injured shoulder's protest, both choosing connection over caution. They separated slowly, and Seris's expression held determination mixed with lingering fear. My people don't have vocabulary for what I feel because we eliminated the need centuries ago, but I choose this, choose you, even knowing it may fail, even knowing your species might disappoint the faith I have staked my life upon. We probably will. Humans are excellent at disappointing expectations. Then I will adapt, unpredictably, irrationally, with emotional compromise. Your species considers strength rather than weakness. Outside, diplomatic convoys arrived bringing complications they'd navigate together. Inside, 2 people from impossible distances held each other while snow fell, choosing beginning over ending, connection over safety, love over logic, despite every rational calculation suggesting they'd both just committed to vulnerability. Neither could fully protect. Ethan realized his life had transformed completely from elaborate isolation to desperate hope that meaning might matter more than optimization after all.